Note, change of schedule. This episode is going to take us through day 9 and day 10. Also, forgive me for the tardiness of uploading these episodes. I was in the process of doing just that when I decided, stupidly, to record my golf swing. Bad idea. Here's the first of 3 episodes. In his farewell address to the nation before he left the White House, President Barack Hussein Obama, he had a question for the U.S. citizen and the incoming next president. He said, and I'm going to paraphrase, the United States is guided by the Constitution, and the Constitution are only words on a piece of paper. If we don't live by those rules, those laws, if we don't live by those words, then who are we? Day 9 was just a regular day. Not much to remember other than what happened 2 hours before we went home. I was asked for the 6th day in a row if I thought Mia used too much force by introducing the gun. As I began to answer the question, I became very annoyed. My answer had not changed over those days. No, I won't say you guys are wrong, but my definition of too much force is about what she does with that gun once she's in possession of it. She would have had to do something illegal with it. This was my admission to her using too much force. The evidence seemed crystal clear. I then asked them, why were they continuously questioning whether I believed the defendant used too much force, and where did they get this idea? Someone yelled out, Instruction 27. That's strange, because we'd only gotten to the mid-teens of the instructions under voluntary manslaughter. Going through each instruction took up a large amount of time. I flipped through 3 pages and began to read quietly. As I read through instruction 27, a smile rose upon my face. Then I began to laugh to myself, silently. This jury instruction was what I was searching for. The Pythagorean theorem. A squared. The jury must decide if the defendant started the fight. If the jury decides the defendant started the fight, then B squared. The defendant could not use too much force, which equaled the hypotenuse of C squared, in which the jury must find the defendant guilty of voluntary manslaughter, thus creating a potent 3-sided right triangle where 2 opposing sides equal the hypotenuse. I found my what and my why. I began cheesing from ear to ear. Then I looked up to let them know I had finished reading the instruction. I was questioned by the rule juror.
Did you read it?
Yes, I answered. She then tried to insult me by asking,
Did you understand what you read?
I held back my laughter. Within those 9 days of questioning me to subscribe to their idea of too much force, they chose to never ask me the other question. While looking across the table to the woman that agreed with me on self-defense, I blurted, so the jury decided she started the fight. It was in this moment that I realized the jury did not need my vote to answer the other question. A square. What happens next is what put me in the twilight zone. That woman stood up and yelled, "It was a mutual fight!" My mouth dropped. I looked to the juror on her right. It just so happened to be the nurse. And what she said puzzled the shit out of me.
It was a whole bunch of starts and stops in the fight.
I looked each juror in their eyes, even the ones who would not look at me, and made each person tell the jury whether or not they believed the defendant started the fight. Out of the 11 jurors that found the defendant guilty of voluntary manslaughter based on this instruction, 6 people thought Mia did not start the fight. I was right. They didn't need my vote. During voir dire, I was asked a crazy question by the prosecutor. It was so wild, I can't remember it, but my answer was simple. I said, I just follow the law, and the law called for the majority of jurors to decide if the defendant created the problem. It didn't ask for a unanimous jury. I was bewildered, to say the least. Here I am, the only juror that cast the defendant not guilty because I had not seen a jury instruction that fit the description of the evidence. Now I'm being told by the jury that this instruction, instruction number 27, didn't fit the evidence either. When I posed a second question to the jury as to whether we wanted to discuss if the defendant started the fight, I was interrupted by the ruled juror. She leaned in, speaking into my ear.
Now you don't want to open that door,
she replied. As soon as she finished talking, the juror that tried to hang it on second-degree murder jumped in and said, "That's why we should go back to second degree." My God, where am I? I wondered as I slumped in my seat. It was clear to me that these jurors were incapable of giving the defendant a fair trial. Those jury instructions that each juror had in front of them to read are the rules, the laws that we live by. They're just words on a piece of paper. And 6 jurors denied them for reasons I can't explain. Perhaps they thought she was guilty of something else. I don't know. I wasn't having conversations outside of the trial with these folks. I had sunken even lower in my seat. Then I began to question, what did I miss at lunch? One day, while walking to the bench where the rest of the jurors were eating lunch, I saw some folks who had been sitting in the gallery during the trial. I inadvertently waved to them, a bad habit I picked up from my job as a letter carrier for the United States Postal Service. The people I had seen were familiar to my eyes, and I am accustomed to saying hello to those I recognize. I did not know who they were. I did not know if they were family or friends to either the defendant or victim. I learned later on to whom they were. But what was more of a problem was how close they were sitting next to the jury during lunch. They were extremely close, within an earshot, separated by a bush. I'm not saying they did anything wrong. They were there having lunch too. In that moment, I decided to never eat with the jury again. Instead, I would go home for lunch for the rest of the trial. I was in the dark amongst all these people on the jury. It was not peaceful, quite disturbing, I must admit, but I was right, and I knew it. I'm not always right, but something wasn't right during deliberations, and it wasn't me. Most jurors never ask for the jury instructions during deliberations. They don't know they have a right to them, so they go off their notes or memory. Then they compromise. Well, I didn't have to, especially when I knew I was right. Day 9 was also a Wednesday. Before we closed deliberations for the day, someone recommended we watch the video of the defendant's interview with the detective. I heard clearly what the district attorney was trying to get us to listen to during closing arguments. The defendant made a statement to the detective that made his expression change. She seemed agitated while she said, "I shot him," then called for her lawyer as the detective became alive. He was about to do what he learned how to do over the years, his job. Words on a piece of paper can't give you the emotions behind what you hear or see. I heard what Mia said the night of the incident, and it made me nauseous. I left that day filled with so many emotions that I wore it on my face. I began to walk the way I was feeling as I walked to my car. When I got outside the courthouse, a police officer was pacing his way towards me. I thought to myself, I should change my demeanor or the look on my face because he's going to think something is wrong with me. He passed by my shoulder. I was wrong. He hadn't noticed. But then he turned around and stopped me by asking, "Hey, are you okay?" I turned back to look at him. "I'm on a jury," I said. He smiled and continued on his way. When I got to my car, I sat in disbelief, shocked. I didn't leave until I came up with a solution as to what I was going to do the next day. My mind was completely empty. I could think of nothing. Too emotionally wired. I sat there perplexed for more than 30 minutes until I came up with breaking the film down the way I would as I watched my next basketball opponent hit play, then rewind over and over again. I will eventually find what's out of the ordinary. Day 10 was a Thursday. As soon as I came in, I wanted to immediately watch the film, but I couldn't because the jury, for the seventh day in a row, asked me if I thought she used too much force by retrieving the gun. I answered their question just to placate them, but I was irritated, extremely irritated, especially after the jury foreperson kept mocking me. "Well, if you pull a gun on somebody, you better shoot them." Oddly enough, they never wanted to answer the other question. Did she start the fight? Although they didn't have a problem saying the night of the incident's fight was different than all the other fights. They wouldn't say what, and they didn't know how. Hell, we didn't know what the hell was going on with this family. We knew they almost fought every day, but we really didn't know shit. We didn't know anything other than this night was different because someone lost their life. Hell, who am I to ask these jurors if the defendant started the fight? If they don't want to answer that question, they're not going to answer that question. But they'll do everything possible to get me to answer the question they want me to answer because they have something to prove. And the reality is, they inadvertently allowed the defendant to use too much force. See, you have to know how to read. You have to be able to understand what it is you read. That's why it's called reading and comprehension. The instruction read, if the jury doesn't decide that the defendant started the fight, then we couldn't answer the opinion, which was, did she use too much force? So by way of them never answering that question, they gave the defendant the right to use too much force. Sad, isn't it? But she's guilty because she introduced the gun. And that's what was different. Even though we knew there was a prior incident where something unsavory happened with that gun. Same gun, but hell, we won't talk about it. They'll just keep asking me if I think she used too much force. At this point, I needed a break, so we took 10. When we got back, I immediately started watching the film. I went right to the source. I played it and rewound it countless times. I looked at the nurse who was seated right next to the TV and asked her, had she heard this? Had she heard what the defendant was saying? She replied,
It's as though she doesn't know what she's saying.
I agreed. Surely, if the defendant knew what she was saying, then she would know she was contradicting herself. But then I thought, is she saying anything different than what she's been saying? So I rewound the video to see what caused her to get her to that moment. Mia seemed irritated by having to answer the detective's questions. She had been there for some time and was taking responsibility for her actions. What more did he want from her? That's what I got while watching it over and over and over again. I couldn't definitively say she was admitting to murder, though for a moment I thought there was more to this story. But what? I didn't know, and I didn't go looking because the trial session was over. The deliberations had begun. Knowing these jurors wouldn't be honest for whatever reason, I told them to let the judge know I didn't have a verdict. He told us to go back in there and work on things. But I didn't feel like it. The majority of the 6 jurors that wouldn't commit to the facts, evidence of the case, that the defendant started the fight, were women. Maybe they enjoy being violent to their husbands or boyfriends. Maybe they've gotten away with it before and tried putting their hands on their spouse and it went completely wrong, like in this case. But they didn't either have a gun or they took whatever came their way. Whatever it was odd. What was I supposed to do here? The right thing? Find the defendant guilty even though I knew those jurors would never admit the truth? They did the opposite of what the jury foreperson asked of them. Instead of answering the other question, a question of true or false, real or fake, yes or no, fact or fiction, they chose to cherry pick from different instructions instead of using the entire instruction. It was as though they decided to replace "did the defendant start the fight" with what they wanted to be the truth, which in itself is a lie. Should we be on the jury if we can't follow these simple instructions? This isn't a free-for-all, yet we call ourselves civil, living in a civil society where we choose to avoid our civility. That sounds evil. Sorry, not sorry. The jury is supposed to be different than the defendant. The jury is supposed to be reasonable and fair. It is the defendant that is or has shown through the evidence beyond reasonable doubt, if found guilty, that they are unreasonable and unfair to the victim. If the jury isn't, perhaps they should be the defendant. The magic number was 7, and we couldn't get to that number no matter how hard we tried. 11 members shut down because they didn't want to answer the most important part of the instruction. I am not sheep, and I am not a shepherd. To move with the crowd when I know they are jumping off a bridge is insane. So I left it alone and told the jurors to give me the weekend to think over my verdict. If you've been a jury member on any case, civil or criminal, and you found the case to either be interesting or you found your jury deliberations to be interesting, please email me at truckstop@gmail.com. That's truckstop@gmail.com. TRUCHSTOPP@gmail.com. Next time on Fetch Productions presents Jury Files, Season 1, Do the Wrong Thing, Days 11, 12, and 13. This episode of Do the Wrong Thing was written by me, recorded by me, edited by me, executive produced by me. Who am I? Kadea, spelled and pronounced like the vegan cheese. Make sure you listen to Fetch Production Presents Jury Files, Season 1, Do the Wrong Thing, anywhere you get your podcast.